Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, you're invited on a journey through history with calm, steady storytelling meant to help you unwind and drift toward rest. Over the next 2 hours, we'll wander through 4 extraordinary chapters of the past, told gently and in detail so you can let the weight of the day slip away. First, we'll step into the Tudor court, where the diabolical life of King Henry VIII shaped kingdoms and destinies. From there, we'll travel across the harsh American frontier to follow the desperate journey of the Donner Party. Then, we'll pause in colonial New England, where fear and superstition gripped an entire community during the Salem Witch Trials. And finally, we'll move into the storm of the American Civil War, tracing the struggles, sacrifices, and hopes of a nation divided. So settle in, breathe deeply, and let's begin our quiet journey through history. Step into the velvet-draped halls of Tudor England. The scent of beeswax candles clings to the air. Courtiers whisper in corners. And at the centre of it all, one man with a crown and a temper. His name was Henry VIII. To marry the king was to be elevated beyond imagination. Gold, jewels, power. But for the 6 women who stood beside him at the altar, that power came at an unbearable cost. This is the story of 6 queens, of loyalty discarded, of innocence betrayed, of ambition punished. It is the story of how being loved by a king could kill you. Catherine of Aragon, the loyal queen, cast aside. She was just a teenager when she first came to England from Spain. Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, princess of one of Europe's mightiest houses. She married Henry's brother, Arthur, but Arthur died. And so, years later, Catherine married the younger prince, Henry, who had just ascended the throne. Their early years were full of passion and hope. She bore him children, though only one survived, a daughter, Mary. Catherine was intelligent, politically savvy, and deeply respected. But Henry wanted more, specifically a son. And when years passed without another surviving heir, Henry's eyes wandered. Anne Boleyn appeared at court, charming, witty, elusive, and suddenly Catherine, after nearly 2 decades of faithful marriage, was declared no longer queen. Henry sought an annulment, claiming their marriage had been cursed by God because she'd been his brother's widow. Catherine refused to step aside. She fought him in court and in conscience. But power was on Henry's side. She died alone, banished from court, forbidden even to see her daughter. Her last letter to Henry closed with the words, "Mine eyes desire you above all things." But Henry had already moved on. Anne Boleyn, the queen who lost her head. Anne Boleyn was everything Catherine was not. Young, fashionable, and politically sharp. She refused to be Henry's mistress, demanding he make her queen. And he did. In a whirlwind of court intrigue, England broke from the Catholic Church just to make the marriage happen. Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, but no sons followed. The pressure was unbearable. Courtiers whispered, enemies circled. When Anne miscarried a boy in 1536, Henry snapped. Within months, trumped-up charges of adultery and treason were brought against her. 5 men were arrested, including her own brother. Torture and lies built the case. Anne was found guilty and sentenced to death. Her execution was swift. A French swordsman was brought in to make the beheading clean. She knelt on the scaffold and prayed, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." She was not yet 36. Jane Seymour, the one who gave him a son. Just days after Anne's death, Henry was betrothed again, this time to Jane Seymour. Jane was quiet, devout, and everything Anne was not, and she gave Henry what he most desired, a son, Edward. But childbirth was treacherous. Just 12 days after Edward's birth, Jane died from complications. Henry wore black for months. He called her his true wife, but whether she was lucky or tragic is a matter of debate. She escaped his wrath, but only by dying first. Anne of Cleves, the one who escaped. Anne of Cleves was a German noblewoman. Henry agreed to marry her sight unseen, relying on a flattering portrait by Hans Holbein. But when she arrived in England, Henry was appalled. He declared she looked like a Flanders mare and refused to consummate the marriage. Anne, realizing her life might depend on her obedience, agreed to an annulment. In return, Henry gave her a generous settlement, a royal title, and let her live in comfort as his beloved sister. She lived peacefully for years, watching from a distance as other wives fell. She might have been the luckiest of them all. Catherine Howard, the teen bride, executed. Then came Catherine Howard, Anne Boleyn's cousin. Just a teenager when she caught Henry's eye, she was playful, naive, and dazzling. Henry, now obese and plagued with ulcers, called her his rose without a thorn. But court politics was a nest of spies. Old relationships from Catherine's youth were exposed. Love letters, flings from before, and possibly during, the marriage. Henry flew into a rage. Catherine was arrested, dragged from Hampton Court, and held in the Tower. The night before her execution, she practised laying her head upon the block. On the scaffold, she whispered, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." She was only about 19. Catherine Parr, the survivor. His final wife, Catherine Parr, was a widow twice over and deeply learned. She acted more as nurse than wife, tending to Henry's wounds and temper. She also helped reconcile him with his children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, securing their places in the line of succession. But even she came close to peril. When her reformist religious views angered conservative factions at court, an arrest warrant was drawn up. Catherine, sensing danger, threw herself at Henry's mercy, claiming she only debated religion to distract him from his ailments. It worked. She outlived him, but barely. Closing reflection, the price of being chosen. So, what did it mean to marry Henry VIII? For Catherine of Aragon, decades of devotion, then exile. For Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, the scaffold. For Jane Seymour, death in childbirth. For Anne of Cleves, humiliation but safety. For Catherine Parr, survival through careful submission. Each woman became a pawn in a deadly game of ambition, fertility, and favour. And through it all, Henry grew more paranoid, more volatile, more dangerous. Behind the royal portraits and elaborate gowns were real women, frightened, isolated, and trapped in a gilded cage. To be loved by Henry was to walk a knife's edge. To be forgotten by him, that might have been the greatest mercy of all. Picture this. The marble corridors of Whitehall Palace echo with the heavy stomp of boots. Candles gutter against the draught of opening doors. In the throne room sits a man who once wrote a book defending the Pope, who now signs letters calling himself God's chosen ruler on earth. The year is 1534 and England is no longer Catholic, not because of holy revelation, but because Henry VIII wanted a son. But let's not start with the crown, let's start with the cross. Catherine of Aragon had been Henry's wife for nearly 24 years. She was intelligent, deeply devout, and once adored by Henry, but she had failed to produce a living male heir. Their only surviving child was Mary, bright, stubborn, but a girl, and to Henry, a girl could not secure the Tudor legacy. By 1527, Henry had fixated on Anne Boleyn, a sharp-witted lady-in-waiting who refused to become just another mistress. She wanted marriage, crown, legitimacy. Henry wanted her badly enough to challenge the Pope himself. At first, Henry didn't dream of rebellion. He wrote carefully crafted appeals to Pope Clement VII, asking for an annulment on the grounds that marrying his brother's widow, Catherine had been briefly wed to Henry's brother Arthur, was against biblical law. But the Pope stalled. Politically, he couldn't afford to alienate Catherine, who just happened to be the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. So, month after month passed, then years, and Henry's patience, never thick to begin with, wore thin. By 1532, Henry's mind had shifted. If Rome would not bend, then England would simply stop listening. He appointed Thomas Cranmer, a reform-minded cleric, as Archbishop of Canterbury. In secret, Cranmer married Henry and Anne, and in 1533 the Archbishop declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. The Pope excommunicated Henry, but Henry did not back down. Instead, in 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring the King the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. This was no mere paperwork shuffle. It was a thunderclap that echoed through every village, every monastery, every heart. The Pope was no longer the spiritual leader of England. The King was. For the first time in centuries, England had cut itself from the tree of Catholic Christendom, and at its root, not divine calling, but the will of one man. Not everyone bowed. Sir Thomas More had been Henry's friend, a brilliant scholar, and once his Lord Chancellor. But when asked to swear an oath acknowledging the King's supremacy over the Church, More refused. He stayed silent, refusing to speak against the King, but also refusing to acknowledge his spiritual claim. Silence was not enough. In 1535, after over a year in the Tower of London, More was executed. His last words were simple, chilling. "I die the King's good servant, but God's first." More's death sent a clear message. Henry's England would no longer tolerate ambiguity. To question the King's authority, even quietly, was treason. By the late 1530s, Henry began dismantling England's monasteries. Officially, it was a spiritual cleansing. Monasteries were accused of corruption, superstition, and false relics. In reality, it was a gold rush. Henry saw the Church's wealth, its lands, gold, and centuries-old artefacts, and claimed them for the crown. Over 800 religious houses were dissolved. Monks and nuns were cast out. Libraries were burned. Sacred treasures were melted down. Some abbots were hanged for resisting. The money was used to fund military campaigns and lavish palaces. To the peasantry, the transformation was bewildering. Overnight, the bell towers that had marked the rhythm of life fell silent. Parish altars were stripped bare. Saints disappeared from stained glass. Latin prayers gave way to English ones. It was as though the soul of England had been shaken loose. The Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive rebellion in the north in 1536, was fueled in part by fury over the destruction of the monasteries. Thousands of commoners, clergy, and nobles rose in protest. They demanded the restoration of the old faith. Henry promised mercy, then executed the leaders. Across the country, neighbours turned on one another. Was your priest loyal to Rome or the king? Did your neighbour hide a crucifix or relic? Spies were everywhere. Heresy trials increased. People were imprisoned or burned for clinging to the faith of their fathers. For the average villager, it was a time of terror, a world that once felt eternal. The rituals of birth, marriage, death, and salvation was suddenly uncertain. The king no longer just ruled your body, he now claimed to rule your soul. In crowning himself head of the church, Henry didn't just shift power, he redefined it. He merged the spiritual and the secular collapsing centuries of tradition into his own appetite. He got what he wanted: Anne Boleyn for a while, a male heir, finally through Jane Seymour, and unrivalled authority. But he left behind a kingdom fractured. After Henry's death in 1547, England would swing wildly between Catholicism and Protestantism under his children. Mary the Fern burned Protestants at the stake. Elizabeth I tried to walk a middle line. The chaos of Henry's Reformation lingered for generations. Henry VIII's break from Rome wasn't just an affair of the heart or a policy of power. It was a redefinition of divinity itself. He stood at the centre of a storm he helped create. And in making himself supreme head of the church, Henry didn't just reshape England, he dared to stand in God's place. The question still lingers centuries later. Was it vision or vanity? And what happens to a kingdom when its king believes his voice is louder than heaven's silence? Imagine stepping into the polished halls of Whitehall Palace in the 1530s. The scent of rosewater lingers in the air, mingling with the waxy warmth of freshly lit tapers. Musicians pluck lutes in the gallery. Courtiers laugh over goblets of wine, and a young noblewoman glides past in a dress heavy with pearls. But beneath the perfume and pageantry, something darker churns. You are in the court of Henry VIII, and here smiling is survival. One wrong word, one ill-timed glance, and the very velvet beneath your feet could turn to gallows wood. This is not just a royal court. It is a gilded arena, and the king who rules it, a man whose whims can crown you by morning and behead you by dusk. The king's enforcers, Cromwell and Wolsey. At the heart of this deadly dance stood two men who shaped, and were eventually destroyed by, Henry's courtly machine. Thomas Wolsey, a butcher's son who rose to become the most powerful man in England after the king himself, began by teaching everyone a vital lesson. Brilliance would not save you. Henry adored Wolsey for his administrative genius, his ability to balance the kingdom's books, negotiate with Europe's kings, and arrange grand tournaments fit for gods. But when Wolsey failed to secure the annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the king turned on him like a wounded lion. Stripped of titles, wealth and dignity, Wolsey died en route to his own trial. His crime? Disappointing the king. His successor, Thomas Cromwell, learned well from Wolsey's fall. Ruthless, efficient, and always 2 moves ahead, Cromwell became Henry's chief architect in the Reformation. He masterminded the dissolution of monasteries, oversaw the execution of Anne Boleyn, and signed countless death warrants for traitors who had simply spoken their conscience. But even Cromwell could not outdance Henry forever. When Cromwell arranged a political marriage between Henry and Anne of Cleves, hoping to shore up Protestant alliances, Henry was repulsed. Anne was too plain, too foreign, too unlike the seductive image her portrait had promised. The marriage was annulled, and Cromwell lost his shield. He was arrested during a Privy Council meeting in the middle of his duties, dragged to the Tower, and executed without trial. His head fell on Tower Hill, a chilling reminder that no man, no matter how loyal, could trust the king's favour to last. The courtier's masquerade serving in Henry's court meant living in a theatre of masks. Noblemen crafted entire personas out of flattery, poetry, and calculated charm. They wrote verses to glorify the king, composed masks to flatter his moods, and presented lavish gifts that disguised fear as admiration. But beneath their jewelled collars beat terrified hearts. Even jesters had to be careful how they joked, because Henry's pride was the kingdom's most fragile treasure. To be favoured meant wealth and power. To lose that favour was to hear your name whispered in corridors, and to feel the cold breath of the Tower creeping in. Anne Boleyn's Meteor and Massacre. No one danced the Tudor court's blade edge more fatally than Anne Boleyn and her allies. Anne arrived as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, but quickly bewitched the king with her wit, style, and refusal to be merely a mistress. Her rise was meteoric. She became queen, bore Henry a daughter, and promised sons to come. Her family, particularly her brother George and her father Thomas Boleyn, rose with her, rewarded with titles and lands. But when Anne failed to produce a male heir and Henry's eye drifted, everything changed. Whispers of adultery, accusations of incest, a court trial steeped in lies. Anne's allies, her brother, her closest friends, even court musicians, were swept up in a purge so brutal it felt like a thunderstorm made of blades. Torture was used to force confessions. Testimonies were fabricated. Heads rolled like dice at a game where the king alone chose the rules. Anne's final words before her execution were calm, almost surreal. "I am come hither to die, and I die a good Christian woman." And then the sword fell. Psychological terror and the Tower. Perhaps the most insidious tool of Henry's tyranny wasn't the axe or the noose, but the slow drip of psychological warfare. Spies roamed the halls in servants' livery. Your closest friend might be feeding your words to the Privy Council. You might find your own signature forged onto a treasonous letter, or your wife questioned over things you said in your sleep. The Tower of London loomed in every nobleman's mind like a spectre. Some were sent there without charges, held for months in silence. Some confessed under duress. Others went mad in their cells, listening to the screams of executions from the yard. Every man in Henry's orbit knew he could be next. The tyrant in velvet. Henry was not always the ogre of legend. In his youth he had been charismatic, golden-haired, even idealistic. He was a poet, a composer, a skilled jouster, but power and paranoia curdled his spirit. By his later reign he had grown obese, plagued by ulcers, and consumed by suspicion. He wielded charm like a weapon. One day he might clasp your hand and call you brother. The next he might sign your death warrant between sips of wine. His court was built on fear, dressed in ermine. And while the masks and minstrels played on, the courtiers danced, carefully, desperately, always just inches from the blade. To serve in Henry VIII's court was to live in constant theatre, where you had to know your lines, wear your mask, and never, ever forget who held the power. The king was the sun. To be close meant warmth and the risk of burning alive. And so they smiled, and so they sang, and so they fell, one by one. Henry's haunted legacy. The year is 1547. The air in Whitehall Palace is heavy with the scent of rot, tallow candles and whispered prayers. In a grand but shadowed chamber, England's most infamous king lies dying. Once a golden prince of unmatched charm and promise, Henry VIII now resembles a cautionary tale carved in human flesh, bloated, fevered, his ulcerated leg leaking through the bedclothes. As his attendants shrink from the stench, and his physicians wring their hands, a kingdom holds its breath. Henry Tudor, the man who split a church to satisfy his will, has run out of time. But the damage he's wrought is just beginning to unfold. By the time of his death at age 55, Henry was nearly unrecognisable from the dashing young monarch who once jousted in golden armour and wrote love songs in French. Years of poor health, likely complicated by obesity, type 2 diabetes, and a chronic festering leg wound from a jousting accident, had transformed him into something almost spectral. The wound on his thigh, once just an injury, had become a weeping ulcer, oozing pus and emitting a smell so noxious that courtiers stood downwind of their sovereign. It never properly healed, a symbol of rot that clung to him both physically and metaphorically. Some whispered it was a punishment from God. Others, more quietly, wondered if it was a curse. In his final days, Henry was tormented not just by pain, but by the fear that his dynasty, so brutally crafted, would collapse without him. England was steeped in superstition. The night Henry died, strange lights were reported in the sky, auroras perhaps, or just winter lightning. An old prophecy once warned that a Tudor would die when 1,000 angels sang. As fate would have it, Henry died at the exact location called Sion Abbey, where a choir of angelic monks had once resided before he dissolved it. His coffin, bloated and poorly sealed, allegedly burst open en route to Windsor. Legend says the corpse oozed onto the church floor where dogs lapped at the royal fluids. To many it was divine retribution. Henry, who had desecrated monasteries and played God, now fed beasts in a holy place. Whether myth or morbid truth, the symbolism was clear. Henry's death did not end his influence. It only scattered the pieces of his legacy, bloody, brittle, and cursed. Henry left one legitimate male heir, Edward VI, born of Jane Seymour. But the child was fragile, a pale, bookish boy raised more by tutors than soldiers. He ascended the throne at just 9 years old, too young to rule, his kingdom managed by ambitious regents. Edward was a committed Protestant and a tool of reformist nobles. During his brief reign, the English church turned further from Rome, churches were stripped of icons and Latin was replaced with English. But behind the reforms, Edward was wasting away. Historians now believe he suffered from tuberculosis. His coughing fits grew worse, he became skeletal, and by 15 he was dead, leaving behind a Protestant nation with no Protestant heir. The throne next passed to his half-sister Mary, Henry's eldest daughter born of Catherine of Aragon, and Mary had not forgotten the wrongs done to her mother. Mary Tudor's reign is one of contradiction. She was deeply devout and personally courageous, but also unyielding in her mission to restore Catholicism. Her marriage to Philip of Spain, deeply unpopular with the English, was a political and religious alliance. It triggered rebellion and fear. Then came the burnings. Over 280 Protestants were executed under her command, burned at the stake as heretics, men, women, even teenagers. Some died praying in English as the flames took them. The image of Bloody Mary was born, fueled in part by Protestant propagandists like John Fox, but grounded in terrible truth. And still, Mary died childless. Once again, the Tudor hope for a secure dynasty crumbled into ash. The crown passed to Elizabeth, Henry's last surviving child. Elizabeth was everything her father both feared and failed to be: shrewd, self-reliant, and loved. Yet she too bore the burden of Henry's ghost. She inherited a country fractured by religious violence, battered by foreign threats, and wary of monarchs who loved too hard or too recklessly. She chose a different path. She would not marry. To some, it was a personal decision. To others, political genius. But beneath the glitter of the Golden Age lay a deeper truth. Elizabeth knew what Henry's obsession with succession had cost. 6 wives, 2 religions, thousands of deaths. Instead, she married England. And with the help of myth-makers and portraits, she recast herself as the Virgin Queen, divine, eternal, untouchable, a living goddess who would rule alone. It was not love that preserved her throne. It was fear, calculation, and her refusal to repeat her father's mistakes. Even now, Henry's legacy refuses to fade. He is said to haunt Hampton Court, striding through candlelit halls, dragging his wounded leg behind him. Visitors report strange sounds, groans, footsteps, even shouting. Whether real or imagined, the ghost fits. After all, Henry never truly left the stage. He haunts the nation he reshaped through the Church of England he created, the dynastic chaos he sparked, and the centuries of conflict over religion, rule, and identity. Every monarch who followed has lived in his shadow. Every debate about power, marriage, divorce, and faith in Britain bears his fingerprints. He wanted a legacy of glory. He left a legacy of ghosts. And so the story of Henry VIII does not end with his death. It seeps through the stones of palaces, echoes in the cries of martyrs, and lingers in the portraits of queens who refused to marry. A king obsessed with control lost even that in the end. All that remains is the shadow he cast, a shadow long and chilling, cast across the centuries, where power and ruin walk hand in hand. In the spring of 1846, nearly 100 pioneers packed their wagons and turned their eyes westward. They weren't wild adventurers or grizzled frontiersmen. They were ordinary families, farmers, craftsmen, and merchants from Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri, drawn by the dream of California. A land whispered about in taverns and newspapers, where the soil was rich, the weather mild, and opportunity endless. Among them were the Donner brothers, George and Jacob, experienced farmers in their 60s who had sold their land and gathered their families for the journey. Another prominent leader was James Fraser Reed, a proud and ambitious man who believed the West offered more than just land. For him, it was a chance to rise. They called themselves the Donner-Reed Party. They had no idea their journey would become one of the darkest chapters in American pioneer history. Like many others, the Donner Party joined a larger wagon train departing from Independence, Missouri, part of the Great Migration westward. Thousands were heading toward Oregon and California along the well-trodden California Trail. But as the wagons creaked westward over the plains, Reed came into possession of a new guidebook. It was written by a man named Lansford Hastings, an ambitious and largely untested promoter who claimed to have found a faster route to California, one that bypassed the northern loop of the Standard Trail in favor of a direct path through the Wasatch Mountains and across the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings called it the Hastings Cut-Off. On paper, it promised to shave off 300 miles. For emigrants who had already spent weeks on the trail, it sounded like salvation. But Hastings had never travelled the full route with wagons. He had only done it once, on horseback, and no wagon train had ever successfully taken the cut-off. Warnings came. A seasoned mountain man named James Clyman met Reed and advised him bluntly, "Don't take that route. It's not passable." But Reed's ambition clouded his judgment. Hastings's words, printed in confident ink, felt more convincing than the dusty caution of an old trapper. By the time they reached Fort Bridger in modern-day Wyoming, the Donner Party had splintered from the larger train and committed to the shortcut. They were about to step off the map. From the very beginning, the Hastings Cut-Off proved a disaster. The Wasatch Mountains were steep, forested, and tangled with undergrowth. It took them over 2 weeks to cut a path through just 80 miles of terrain. Men swung axes from dawn to dusk, while wagons groaned under the strain. Oxen grew weak, tempers grew shorter, food began to dwindle faster than expected. When they finally emerged from the mountains, it wasn't relief that greeted them. It was the Great Salt Lake Desert, a vast, shimmering expanse of salt flats that stretched endlessly to the horizon. The heat was suffocating. The reflection from the ground seared the eyes. Hastings had claimed the desert crossing would take 2 days. It took them nearly 6. Water ran out. Animals collapsed. The sand blistered their feet. They were forced to abandon wagons, possessions, and even family heirlooms. The Reeds lost 4 wagons in the desert. The party began to fracture. Blame and suspicion took root like rot. By the time they rejoined the original trail near modern-day Elko, Nevada, they had lost nearly a month. Winter was closing in. As they continued west, the consequences of delay began to mount. Food was short, tensions flared. On October 6, 1846, a violent altercation broke out between James Reed and another teamster, John Snyder. During a dispute over tangled wagons, Snyder struck Reed with a whip. Reed retaliated with a knife and killed him. It was the moment that nearly destroyed them. The others held a crude trial on the prairie. Some demanded Reed be hanged. Ultimately, he was banished, forced to ride ahead alone into the wilderness. His wife, Margaret, pleaded for mercy and stayed behind with their children. Now the leadership was divided, morale was low, and the mountains were ahead. On October 20th, the Donner Party reached the eastern edge of the Sierra Nevada. By then, the mountains were already dusted in white. They camped at Truckee Lake, modern-day Donner Lake, planning to cross in the morning. But overnight, snow began to fall, a thick, wet snow that blanketed the trail and made the steep passes impassable. They tried to push forward the next day, but the snow kept coming. Oxen floundered, wagons sank, visibility vanished. The families turned back to the lake, huddled in makeshift cabins and lean-tos of logs and canvas. Others, like the Donners themselves, were still miles behind at Alder Creek, caught in the same storm. The pass had closed. They were trapped. Historians estimate that had the Donner Party arrived just 1 week earlier, they might have made it through, but bad decisions, especially the choice to follow Hastings, had sealed their fate. In total, 87 men, women, and children were caught on the wrong side of the Sierra Nevada as one of the harshest winters on record descended. The mountains were impassable, their food was nearly gone, and nobody knew they were there. It had begun with hope, but now that hope was buried beneath 20 feet of snow. And the real horror hadn't even started yet. Snow buried the landscape like a tombstone. The party was scattered across two primary encampments, one at Truckee Lake, now known as Donner Lake, and another 6 miles east at Alder Creek, where the Donner family was stalled with a broken axle and failing oxen. They had no idea they were about to spend 4 brutal months entombed in snow, and they were woefully unprepared. At Truckee Lake, 59 people, men, women and children, crowded into a few hastily built cabins. These were not homes. They were log walls with gaps stuffed with mud and rags, barely enough to keep out the wind. Roofs sagged under the weight of snow. Floors turned to mud. Smoke from cook fires had nowhere to go, choking the families inside. At Alder Creek, 21 others, including George and Jacob Donner and their families, had no cabins at all. They lived under lean-tos made from branches and animal hides, half buried in drifts. Food supplies were already low before the storm. The last of the oxen meat was being salted, or worse, left to rot after animals wandered off and froze to death. They chewed through flour, dried apples and beans, quickly descending into famine. When the food ran out, they boiled the hides of their dead oxen. Day after day they scraped charred leather from bones and boiled it into gluey broth. They pulled bark from trees, dug for roots, ate mice, even chewed on old saddle straps. But nothing filled the gnawing emptiness. In those freezing cabins, survival wasn't just a test of the body. It was a siege on the mind. Children watched their parents wither into shadows of themselves. Mothers gave their last crumbs to infants who cried themselves hoarse. Fathers fought the madness of helplessness. Diaries that survive, like that of teenager Patrick Breen, tell of long, silent days broken only by the howling wind and endless snow. One entry reads simply, "It continues to snow. We are all very hungry." Tensions boiled. Accusations flew of hoarding, of theft, of selfishness. Resentments that had started on the trail now threatened to fracture what little trust remained. One man, William Eddy, tried again and again to lead small groups out of the mountains, but each time the snow drove them back. Some left and never returned. One woman died while clutching her infant child. Another sat for hours beside her husband's corpse, unable to move. Hope was running out. Death came slowly and without ceremony. It wasn't just starvation, it was infection, cold, exhaustion, and despair. The first to die were often the weakest, infants, the elderly, the already ill, but not always. Strong men began to waste away, unable to keep warm or find food. Muscles wasted, bones protruded, bodies refused to rise from bedding. Jacob Donner died in December, followed by his brother George weeks later. Their wives, Tamsin and Elizabeth, stayed with their children, refusing to leave their husbands even as the snow buried the tents around them. The bodies began to accumulate, and something unspeakable began to creep through the camp. We don't know who broke first. Some accounts suggest that the idea of eating the dead was whispered by the Graves family. Others say it began with the bodies at Alder Creek, where the Donners perished. But by mid-December, multiple survivors, including children, reported that flesh from the deceased was being preserved, cooked, shared. It wasn't a feast, it was agony. According to survivor Louis Keseberg, some people wept as they ate. Others refused for days, only to give in when their children lay dying. They made desperate calculations: who had already died, who was too far gone to be saved, and who might be next. Some crossed even more horrifying lines, according to the rumours that would later surface. Though evidence is inconclusive, accusations of murder for meat haunted certain survivors, especially Kaiserberg, for the rest of their lives. For most, cannibalism was a last resort, but it was no longer unthinkable, and still no rescue came. The mountains remained impassable. Letters sent ahead months earlier had not yet reached Sacramento. In California, few people even knew the Donner Party was in trouble. Storm after storm battered the Sierra. In January, snow measured over 22 feet deep, and the families at Truckee Lake and Alder Creek had only each other. Children who once played along the trail now lay motionless under blankets. Parents wasted away beside them. They were now ghosts waiting to die. But even in this frozen hell, hope refused to fully die. On December 16th, a group of 17 people made one final desperate attempt to escape the mountains on foot. They made snowshoes from rawhide and wood and called themselves the Forlorn Hope, a military term for a last-ditch assault. 9 of them were women. Many were barely teenagers. They left with only meagre rations and the weight of their family's survival on their shoulders. Behind them, the camps settled into a grim rhythm of waiting and dying. But at last, in February of 1847, help came. A rescue party funded and led by concerned settlers from California, alarmed by delayed reports, finally fought through the pass. What they found was beyond imagining. They expected starving people. They did not expect the smell. One rescuer later said he could never unsee the scenes at Truckee Lake. Sunken-eyed children crouched beside gnawed bones. A mother cradling her child with fingers blackened from frostbite. A man boiling a soup that was unmistakably made of human flesh. Some of the rescuers wept, others turned away in horror. Still, they did their job. They brought food, blankets, and hope. But they couldn't take everyone. They led a small group of survivors down the pass and promised to return. 3 more rescue missions would be needed over the next 2 months. Each time they found fewer alive. In the end, 87 people had been trapped in the mountains. Only 45 would make it out. But for the rest of their lives, every survivor would carry the weight of that winter, of the silence, the hunger, and the line they were forced to cross. December the 16th, 1846. 17 people stepped into the white wilderness. They were not soldiers or mountain men. They were exhausted parents, frightened teenagers, and children no older than 12. For weeks they had sat in the cabins at Truckee Lake and watched their families die. The snow piled higher, the food vanished, and no help had come. So they became the help. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope, a military term for a desperate assault with little chance of success. And that name proved all too fitting. They strapped crude snowshoes to their frost-bitten feet, made from ox hide and branches. They packed scraps of dried meat, what little remained, and wrapped themselves in blankets and pieces of clothing. Their destination was 100 miles away, Sutter's Fort in California's Central Valley. They were heading west, over mountains none of them had ever seen in clear weather, now blanketed in deep, blinding snow. The wind howled. The sun's reflection off the snow burned their eyes. The temperature dropped below 0, and the trail had long since vanished. The group included 5 men, 9 women, and 3 children. Among them were Mary Graves, just 19 years old, and William Eddy, who had already lost a child to starvation. There were also Jay Fosdick, a newlywed, and Sarah Foster carrying her infant daughter. They walked in silence, and soon the silence would turn to horror. Within the first few days, snow blindness set in. Their crude snowshoes began to fall apart. One man, Charles Stanton, a bachelor who had earlier brought supplies to the camp, fell behind in the snow and simply sat down. He was never seen alive again. Others began collapsing. One by one, the weaker members of the group sank into the snow, unable to rise. With no food, they faced the inevitable. They debated. Then they decided. They would eat the bodies of the dead. The first victim was Stanton. They removed his muscle carefully with shaking hands. They dried the flesh over a fire, avoiding eye contact. Some refused to eat. Others forced it down with tears and trembling. When another man died, Antonio, a Mexican teamster, they repeated the process. There were no animals, no plants, no escape, only snow, wind, and flesh. Sarah Foster's infant daughter was dying. She cried until she couldn't anymore, then went silent. Sarah, delirious with hunger, refused to leave her side. She died 2 days later, her baby in her arms. The survivors buried the child in the snow and moved on. Next to fall was J. Fosdick, newly married to Mary Graves' sister. As he weakened, he pleaded with his companions not to let him be eaten. His wife tried to protect him, cradling him in her arms. But when he died, she collapsed with grief. And the others, they were starving. They took what they needed and moved on. Not all who died were victims of the elements. 2 Miwok men, Luis and Salvador, had been part of the rescue effort that brought food to the lake earlier. They had joined the Forlorn Hope on their march west, despite growing tensions. Some of the emigrants eyed them with suspicion, viewing them as outsiders. After several days, Luis and Salvador, both stronger than the rest, began to suspect that the others might turn on them. So they quietly left camp one night, hoping to reach help alone. They were found days later by William Foster. Foster, crazed with hunger and grief after losing his child, shot them both in the head. They had done nothing wrong. They were simply food. The group ate them. This act, murder for the sake of meat, would haunt survivors for decades. Some denied it, others never spoke of it again. Weeks passed, the group dwindled. Then, miraculously, they saw tracks in the snow, human tracks, not from their party, but fresh ones heading east. They had crossed paths with a group of Native Americans from the Maidu tribe. The Maidu, horrified at the starving survivors, gave them food, acorn meal and pine nuts, and pointed the way to help. This act of compassion saved the remaining 7 survivors. On January 17, 1847, after 33 days in the mountains, William Eddy stumbled into a ranch near Johnson's Ranch in California. He was sunburned, frostbitten, and half mad. But he had made it. News of the Donner Party's plight spread like wildfire, and one word seized the public's imagination: cannibalism. In San Francisco, in Sacramento, and in the forts and ranches of the valley, people whispered about the group who had eaten their own to survive. Newspaper headlines sensationalized the story. Some portrayed them as savages, others as victims of fate. But amid the gossip, a rescue party was quickly formed. Eddy led them back into the mountains, and what they found defied belief. While the Forlorn Hope struggled west, the people back at Truckee Lake and Alder Creek had endured another month of hell. They had resorted to the same terrible measures. One woman was discovered with a body in her cooking pot. Children were found lying beside gnawed limbs. Survivors sat in the dark with haunted eyes, barely able to speak, but they were still alive. The rescuers brought food and blankets, but they couldn't take everyone, not in that storm, not with such deep snow. So they promised to return. Over the next 2 months, 3 more rescue missions were mounted. By April 1847, the last survivor had been brought out. Of the original 87 who entered the mountains, only 45 survived. Cannibalism had occurred, murders had been committed, families had been destroyed. But so had courage. Mary Graves, who had watched her brother-in-law die, went on to live a full life, though she never escaped the memory of that march. William Eddy, who had saved himself and others, spoke little of what he had done, but he never stopped searching for the child he had to leave behind. And Louis Keseberg, who would become the most vilified of the survivors, was accused, perhaps falsely, of murder and cannibalism beyond necessity. He spent the rest of his life as a pariah. The Forlorn Hope had done the unthinkable to survive, but they had also done the impossible. They brought word of the Donner Party's fate to the world, and in doing so they saved the lives of dozens still waiting in the snow. April 1847. 4 months after the snow began to fall, the final survivor was carried out of the mountains. Her name was Keseberg's baby daughter, barely alive, wrapped in blankets stiff with frost. She was one of the last to leave what would soon become one of the most infamous places in American history, Donner Lake. By then, the camps were silent. The cabins had collapsed. Bones lay scattered beneath trees. The trail of wagons had long since vanished beneath the spring melt. But the story was only just beginning. News of the Donner Party's ordeal reached California like a clap of thunder. First came the headlines, "Cannibalism in the Sierras." Then came the scandal sheets and editorials, most of them teetering between fascination and revulsion. Survivors were called ghouls, savages, heroes, and monsters, all in the same breath. People demanded answers. Why had they taken the Hastings cutoff? Why had they left so late in the season? Why had some lived while others died? And above all, had they really eaten each other? The answers were messy, complicated, and too painful for many survivors to face, let alone explain. The 45 survivors were a patchwork of shattered families. Some had lost spouses, others children. Many had no home to return to. They were traumatized, malnourished, and exhausted. And worst of all, they were infamous. Virginia Reed, just 13 years old, had watched her mother carry the burden of 5 surviving children through the snow. Her father, James Reed, previously banished from the party, had been among those to return with the rescue teams. The Reeds eventually settled in San Jose, where Virginia would become a school teacher and later write about her experiences. Her motto became, "Never take no cut-offs and hurry along as fast as you can." Mary Graves, who had survived the Forlorn Hope and witnessed the deaths of her brother and brother-in-law, tried to rebuild her life, but she never fully recovered. In a letter she wrote, "I often dream of those days and wake with a start, bathed in tears." Tamsen Donner, one of the most tragic figures, had refused to abandon her dying husband George at Alder Creek. She sent her children ahead with a rescue party, none of whom could protect them from starvation. Tamsen stayed behind, faithful to the end. She was later found dead beside her husband's frozen body. No one knows for sure whether she died of hunger, exposure, or something worse. No survivor was more vilified than Louis Keseberg. When the final rescue party arrived, they found Keseberg alone at Truckee Lake, surrounded by bones, cooking a pot of stew. The stew, they said, contained human flesh. Keseberg didn't deny it, but he claimed he had only eaten the already dead. Still, rumours spread that he had murdered Tams and Donna for food, that he had hoarded supplies, that he had been too eager to consume the dead. One rescuer later claimed, "Of all I have seen and heard, nothing paralleled the horror of Keseberg's camp." Keseberg sued his accusers for defamation and won $1. But the court of public opinion never cleared his name. He spent the rest of his life in poverty, haunted by his reputation. He was called the Cannibal of California. Children ran from him in the streets. In his later years, Keseberg reportedly wept while holding a photograph of the Donna children he had failed to protect. Many survivors were reluctant to speak of what had happened. When they did, stories conflicted, dates blurred, names were forgotten, events softened or denied. Some insisted that cannibalism never occurred. Others admitted to it, but only under extreme necessity. But the trauma was written on their faces. Many suffered nightmares for decades. Some refused to eat meat, others avoided the mountains for the rest of their lives, and yet they carried on. Some remarried, some homesteaded. Some became teachers, ranchers, and lawmakers. Their children, those who survived, would grow up in a state built on the very myth that had nearly killed them, manifest destiny. But they carried a secret their neighbours could never fully understand. They had walked through hell to reach paradise. In the decades that followed, Donna Lake became a site of grim pilgrimage. Treasure hunters scoured the camps for bones and relics. Journalists visited the cabins. A tree stump used to anchor the Breen's roof still stood, its bark scarred from axe marks. Tourists posed beside it for photos, smiling nervously. Eventually, in 1918, a plaque was placed near the lake. It honoured the courage of the pioneers and avoided mentioning the cannibalism altogether. Later, in 1919, the state of California established Donna Memorial State Park, placing a 22-foot-tall statue of a pioneer family atop a stone pedestal. The height of the pedestal, it marked how high the snow had risen during that fateful winter. The story of the Donner Party became more than a tale of tragedy. It became an American parable, a cautionary tale about poor decisions, arrogance, and bad luck, but also a testament to endurance, sacrifice, and the terrible cost of survival. Historians continue to debate the details. Did Lansford Hastings deserve full blame? Was the cannibalism inevitable? Could rescue have come sooner? But those debates often miss the point, because the true horror of the Donner Party wasn't just what they did, it was what they endured, a perfect storm of human failure and natural cruelty. And yet they survived, some of them, not as heroes, not as villains, but as people. People who had faced hunger so deep it consumed their humanity. People who had trudged through snow with the bones of loved ones in their packs. People who looked west and kept walking. What really happened to the Donner Party? Everything you've heard is true, and yet it's not even the half of it. Because the real story isn't about cannibalism. It's about what people become when no one is coming to save them, and what they carry when they finally come home. Imagine you're waking up in a small timber-framed house. The fire has long gone cold. The air bites at your skin. Outside, the ground is frozen, the trees bare, and the sky a dull, unwelcoming grey. This is Salem Village, 1692. Not the romantic New England of Thanksgiving tales and white-steepled churches, but a raw, hard-scrabble settlement full of tension, suspicion, and fear. You are a Puritan, part of a deeply religious community where every moment of life is seen through the lens of sin and salvation. You believe the devil walks among you. You fear that any misstep, any blasphemous word, missed Sabbath, or strange dream might be proof you've fallen from grace. Life is hard here. Food is scarce. The winters are long. Disease comes swiftly. Death, even for children, is never far. In a town of only about 600 people, everyone knows everyone else's business. Resentments fester. Land disputes erupt over stone walls and grazing rights. Family names carry reputations, both proud and damning. There is little room for error, and even less for outsiders. In January 1692, something strange begins in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter Betty and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams begin acting wrong. They shriek, they writhe on the floor, they speak in tongues and complain of being pricked by invisible needles. They huddle in corners, eyes wide with terror, pointing to things no one else can see. Reverend Parris, stern and unbending, is horrified. A physician is called, but he cannot explain the girls' behaviour. Finally, in a diagnosis that would ignite a firestorm, he says they are afflicted, not with illness, but with witchcraft. And just like that, the fuse is lit. Why here? Why now? The seeds had been planted for years. Salem village was embroiled in a bitter feud with neighbouring Salem town. Wealthy merchants to the east, humble farmers to the west. The village had recently built its own meeting house and hired Reverend Parris, but not everyone supported him. He was divisive, demanding, and known for preaching hellfire and damnation from the pulpit. In this small world, power was fragile and fear was potent. There had been whispers of witchcraft before. Superstition ran deep. Children were taught that Satan was real, that he could tempt, possess, and corrupt. Women in particular were seen as spiritually weaker, more susceptible to the devil's influence. It wasn't a matter of if the devil would strike, but when. So, when Betty and Abigail began convulsing and others soon followed, Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, the community was primed to believe it was witchcraft, and they were desperate to root it out. Under pressure to name the source of their torment, the girls began to accuse. They named 3 women: Tituba, the enslaved woman of Reverend Parris; Sarah Good, a destitute beggar who muttered to herself and scowled at passers-by; and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who rarely attended church. 3 women who didn't fit Salem's mould of godliness. 3 women on the fringes of society. When they were arrested and brought in for questioning, the trials, informal at first, were spectacles. The girls screamed in court, flailed on the ground, claiming the accused were stabbing them with invisible knives. It didn't matter that the evidence was invisible. To many, the emotion felt real, and that was enough. Then something unexpected happened. Tituba confessed. Tituba didn't just say she was a witch. She gave a performance, an elaborate tale of flying through the air, of black dogs, and a tall man in dark clothes who forced her to sign his book. She claimed there were more witches hiding in Salem, many more. Why did she confess? Perhaps she was coerced. Perhaps she knew it might spare her life. Perhaps she was trying to give the Puritans exactly what they wanted, a story that fit their fears. Either way, it worked. The hysteria exploded. Suddenly anyone could be a witch. What began as whispers turned into a community-wide panic. Neighbours turned on each other, families accused relatives. Old grudges resurfaced as accusations. If your cow stopped giving milk, if your baby fell sick, if your bread didn't rise, someone had cursed you. By spring, dozens of people had been jailed. The colony's leadership established a special court to handle the flood of accusations. And what had started in one household had become a fever spreading through Essex County. This wasn't just about superstition, it was about control. In a rigid society where conformity was survival, being different was dangerous, and the trials gave people a way to reassert order by purging what they feared, but the cost was enormous. In the coming months, innocent people would hang, families would be torn apart, and all because of a moment in one household, a moment when fear became contagious. This is how the Salem Witch Trials began, not with magic, but with a cold winter, a strict religion, a divided community, and 2 little girls who screamed in the dark. It's spring now in Salem Village, 1692. The frost is thawing, but fear still hangs heavy in the air. The townsfolk gather in anxious clusters, whispering about the devil's work. Everyone knows someone who's been accused, or jailed, or worse. But the most curious and terrifying thing of all, it's the children who are running the show. It began with Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. Then it spread like wildfire to others. Anne Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard, among others. All girls, all young, some as young as 11. In a world where children were expected to be silent, obedient, and invisible, these girls were suddenly centre stage. Everyone hung on their every word. When they entered the courtroom, it wasn't with meekness. It was with drama. They screamed, they convulsed, they claimed to see spectres, ghostly doubles, of the accused tormenting them. They wailed that invisible claws were ripping at their skin. Sometimes they mimicked the exact movements of the accused, as if controlled by some dark power. To the people of Salem, these were not performances. They were proof. The court accepted a new and dangerous kind of testimony, spectral evidence. If a girl said she saw your spectre choking her in a dream or biting her in court, that was admissible as proof of guilt. There didn't need to be physical evidence. No cauldron, no broomstick, no black cat. Just a vision. And so the accusations began to snowball. It wasn't just outcasts like Tituba and Sarah Good anymore. Now it was church-going women, respected men, even a former minister. No one was safe. One girl would cry out, and another would echo her. They fed off one another's fear, or maybe their power. Because suddenly these girls who'd once been nobodies were now arbiters of life and death. Let's talk about Anne Putnam Jr., one of the most active accusers. She was just 12 years old, but her family, the Putnams, had a lot to gain. The Putnams were locked in bitter land disputes with several neighbours, and it just so happened that many of the people Anne accused were connected to those feuds. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe Anne was being used, or maybe she understood, even as a child, how much power she had when she screamed in court. Years later, long after the trials had ended, Anne would stand up in church and publicly apologise. She confessed that she had been deluded by Satan and begged forgiveness for accusing innocent people. But by then it was too late. Her words had already helped send 20 people to their deaths. Historians still debate this question. Some believe the girls were victims of mass hysteria, a psychological phenomenon where intense stress causes physical symptoms. Others suggest it was a kind of trauma response. Many of these girls were orphans or servants who had witnessed violence or lived through war. Mercy Lewis, for instance, had seen her parents killed in a native raid in Maine. Then there's the theory of attention and agency. For once, these girls were being listened to. They were being believed. In a world that rarely gave children a voice, especially girls, they were suddenly the most powerful people in the colony. And once the show began, how could they stop? Inside the courtroom, the trials became spectacles. Imagine sitting on a wooden bench as the accused pleads their innocence. Suddenly the girls across the room begin to scream. They point. They clutch their throats. One falls to the floor in a seizure. Another claims she sees the accused turning into a bird and flying toward her. The judges, grim men in black robes, nod solemnly. For them, this was not theatre. This was divine evidence. The accused, bewildered, would shout, "I am innocent!" But their pleas were drowned out by the wails of the afflicted. And the more dramatic the girls' behaviour, the more credible they seemed. One of the most shocking moments came with the arrest of Rebecca Nurse. She was 71 years old, a respected, pious woman. She had 8 children and was beloved in the community. If someone like her could be accused, no one was safe. In court, the girls cried that her spirit tormented them, even as Rebecca knelt and prayed. Her own sister, Sarah Cloyce, was also accused. Her brothers tried desperately to defend her, even gathering dozens of signatures attesting to her character. But it was no use. Rebecca was found guilty and hanged. The afflicted girls were never punished, never interrogated, never challenged in court. They were believed completely. That blind faith, combined with fear, superstition, and the social tension of a struggling colony, created a runaway train of accusations that couldn't be stopped. In total, over 200 people were accused. Some were released. Some rotted in jail. Others, innocent, terrified, and bewildered, met their end on Gallows Hill, all because a group of young girls cried, "Witch!" In the end, the devil that haunted Salem wasn't the horned creature from their sermons. It was something much more human. It was fear. It was manipulation. It was the terrifying power of accusation, and how easily it can spiral out of control when belief outweighs reason. When children held power in Salem, the consequences were not childish. They were deadly. You're standing in a dim, musty jail cell in Salem, Massachusetts. The air is thick with mildew, the straw beneath your feet damp. You haven't eaten properly in days. You are one of the accused, and your trial is about to begin. You know what's waiting for you in the courthouse. Not justice, but theatre. Not evidence, but accusation. And no matter how many times you say you're innocent, you've seen what happens to people who say the same. You're not afraid of the devil. You're afraid of the court. In May 1692, Massachusetts Governor William Phips established a special court to deal with the chaos, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, meaning to hear and determine. He appointed William Stoughton as Chief Justice. Stoughton was a hardline Puritan with little legal experience, but an unshakable belief that witches were real. The court was given broad authority. It did not follow standard English legal procedure. Hearsay was allowed. Spectral evidence, testimony that the ghost or shape of the accused had attacked someone, was treated as fact. In this courtroom, logic did not rule. Fear did. From the very first trial, the accused stood little chance. They were not allowed legal counsel. They were presumed guilty. Their neighbours and even family members often testified against them. The afflicted girls would perform in court, claiming to be pinched, clawed, or choked. They screamed that they saw the accused spirit flying or transforming into animals. Sometimes they fell to the floor, writhing and shrieking. The court took this as divine confirmation. The accused might be stripped and examined for witches' marks, moles, scars, or skin blemishes said to be teats for feeding imps or demons. Even a birthmark could be damning. If you confessed, you might be spared. If you denied it, you risked death. Some people, desperate to live, confessed to impossible crimes, flying through the air, signing the devil's book, consorting with animals that spoke in human voices. These confessions fueled the panic. If one person admitted to being a witch, surely their neighbour might be one too. One of the most tragic and brutal cases was Giles Corey, an elderly farmer whose wife, Martha, had been accused. When Giles himself was charged, he refused to enter a plea. He understood that if he said guilty, he'd be executed. But if he said not guilty and was found guilty, his land would be taken from his family. So Giles said nothing. To force a plea, the court used peine forte dure, pressing with heavy stones. They stripped him naked, placed him in a pit, laid a board across his chest, and piled heavy rocks on top. As the sheriff demanded a plea, Giles only muttered, "More weight." He died after 2 days of torture. He never entered a plea, and so legally his property passed to his sons, not the state. His defiance became legendary, but it also showed just how far the court was willing to go. In total, 19 people were hanged between June and September of 1692, 14 women and 5 men. They were brought by cart to Gallows Hill, a barren slope just outside town. The executions were public. People gathered to watch. None of the condemned were burned. That's a common myth. In the English colonies, hanging was the method of execution for witchcraft. Before each hanging, the victims were allowed to speak. Some prayed, some forgave their accusers, some cursed the court. Rebecca Nurse, the elderly, devout woman accused earlier, stood calmly and quietly before her execution. Her final words, "Lord, forgive them." To this day, many believe she was the very embodiment of Christian faith, hanged by a society that had lost its way. While the hangings made headlines, the jails were another kind of hell. Over 150 people were imprisoned on witchcraft charges. The jails were overcrowded and filthy. Rats scurried through straw bedding. Disease spread. There was barely enough food or water. At least 5 people died in jail, including Sarah Osborne, one of the first accused who never made it to trial. Pregnant women were not spared. Elizabeth Proctor was convicted and sentenced to death, but her execution was postponed until after childbirth. Her baby saved her life, at least temporarily. Even children weren't immune. Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good, was accused of being a witch. When questioned, she spoke of a snake her mother had given her. A likely misunderstanding, but the court saw it as proof of a familiar spirit. Dorothy was imprisoned for months. When she was finally released, she was never the same. Witnesses said she had gone mad. Her mother, Sarah, was hanged in July. As she stood at the gallows, she looked at the Reverend Nicholas Noyes and declared, "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Years later, Noyes would die from choking on his own blood. By the fall of 1692, the panic began to collapse under its own weight. Governor Phipps, alarmed by the number of executions and the fact that even his own wife was being whispered about, ordered the court dissolved. A new court was created, this time rejecting spectral evidence. The tide turned. Many were released. Some confessed they had lied under pressure. But, for the dead, there would be no justice. The Salem Witch Trials weren't just a tragedy of superstition. They were a catastrophe of law. They showed how justice can be twisted by fear, how rules can be rewritten to fit a narrative, and how quickly a courtroom can become an execution chamber when guilt is assumed and evidence is thrown aside. Salem's trials remind us that the law is only as strong as the people who uphold it. And in 1692, the people failed. It's early 1693. The hangings have stopped. The jail doors creak open. The shrieking in the courtroom has faded to whispers. The people of Salem are left with ashes, of lives, reputations, and trust. The question that now echoes through the colony is simple and terrifying. How did this happen? Governor William Phipps, after months of escalating panic, dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. He created a new court that rejected spectral evidence. Overnight, the flood of executions stopped. Accusations were suddenly viewed with suspicion, not certainty. But the damage had already been done. 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, 5 dead in jail, 200 plus accused, countless reputations, destroyed the afflicted girls, never punished, the judges never formally tried, the public forced to reckon with the question, what had they just lived through? Some tried to make amends. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the few to publicly repent, stood in front of his congregation, bowed his head, and confessed that he had cause to fear. He had shed innocent blood. In 1706, Anne Putnam Jr., one of the lead accusers, stood before her church and admitted her role in the tragedy. She said she had been deluded by Satan. But her words, while sincere, could never bring back those she helped condemn. Others never apologized. Chief Justice William Stoughton, the man most responsible for allowing spectral evidence, showed no remorse. He died with his pride intact and his conscience untroubled. Historians have long debated what really caused the Salem Witch Trials. It wasn't just superstition. The truth is more complex and more human. Here are the leading theories. 1. Religious zeal and Puritanism. Puritanism was strict, unforgiving, and deeply fearful of the devil. Hell was not a metaphor. It was real. Satan was thought to be active, lurking behind every misfortune. In this worldview, spiritual warfare was constant. Anyone could become a tool of the devil, and women, especially outspoken, independent, or non-conforming women, were often seen as especially vulnerable to temptation. The Salem trials were the logical extreme of this belief system, a society so convinced of its own moral purity that it could not recognize its own cruelty. 2. Personal vendettas and land disputes. Some of the accusations were clearly driven by property conflicts and old feuds. The Putnam family accused multiple people with whom they had land disputes. Many of the executed owned valuable farmland that was quickly scooped up after their deaths. When law and religion blur, personal grievances can be disguised as righteousness. Salem wasn't just a witch hunt. It was sometimes a land grab. 3. Political instability and fear. The trials didn't happen in a vacuum. Massachusetts was under political pressure. The colony's charter had been revoked and only recently restored. There had been Native American attacks on the frontier. Many of the afflicted girls were refugees or orphans from these conflicts. The trauma they carried may have fueled their behaviour. In a time of deep uncertainty and instability, the community turned inward, looking for someone to blame. Fourth, ergot poisoning. One of the more unusual theories is ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye grain. If consumed, it can cause hallucinations, spasms, and delirium, symptoms similar to those shown by the afflicted girls. Could bad bread have sparked the panic? Most historians now doubt this theory. The symptoms weren't consistent, and they spread far too socially rather than geographically. It's more likely that fear and suggestion, not fungus, were to blame. Why did the afflicted girls do what they did? Some may have believed they were truly bewitched. Others may have been seeking attention, power, or escape from trauma. Still others may have been manipulated by adults around them. What's clear is that in a society where girls were meant to be silent, submissive, and unseen, they suddenly became powerful. They could speak, cry, point, and the whole world would listen. Power is intoxicating, and sometimes it can be deadly. Salem was not the largest witch hunt in history, not by a long shot. Tens of thousands were executed for witchcraft in Europe over the centuries, but Salem haunts us because it happened in early America, in a supposedly civilized Christian colony, because it revealed how easily law can be warped by fear, because it showed us that belief, left unchecked by reason, can become a weapon, and perhaps because it still happens. Today we may not burn witches, but we still hold trials in the court of public opinion. We still accuse, assume guilt, and destroy reputations with whispers. The tools have changed, but the machinery of panic, fear, blame, and silence remains. Salem is more than a cautionary tale. It is a mirror. It reminds us that the line between justice and vengeance is thin, that the people most certain they are right can be the most dangerous, that hysteria doesn't require proof, just permission. And it teaches us that truth is not always louder than fear, but it must be fought for, even when the mob is roaring. The year is 1863. The air smells of wood smoke, sweat, and wet wool. Campfires crackle in the chill of an early morning near the Rappahannock River, and somewhere among the tired groans of grown men waking to another day of war, a boy rises too, barely 13. His hands are blistered. His uniform doesn't quite fit, and strapped to his chest is a drum nearly as large as his torso. Drummer boys in the American Civil War weren't just patriotic mascots, they were working soldiers. And for many, their jobs were far more grueling, dangerous, and soul-wrenching than anyone ever warned them. Too young for war, but not too young to march. At the start of the Civil War, thousands of underage boys enlisted, some as young as 9 or 10. Technically, the Union Army had age limits, 18 to carry a weapon, 16 for musicians. But reality often bent. Boys lied about their age, recruiters looked the other way, and desperate parents sometimes offered their sons up, believing the drum course would be safer than the rifle line. They were wrong. Drummer boys weren't sent into battle with rifles, but they marched alongside the men who were. Their role? Critical. Their drumbeats set the pace of marches, signalled commands in the chaos of battle, and kept units in step when officers' voices couldn't be heard over cannon fire. drums not just for rhythm, but for orders. Before modern radios, battlefields ran on sound, bugles, whistles and drums. A specific rhythm might mean advance, another fall back. A long roll might signal a charge, so these boys had to be precise, memorize dozens of commands. And they had to be loud, drumming through gunfire, smoke and screaming men. If a drummer misplayed a call, soldiers might run the wrong way, or die trying. They weren't just musicians. They were communication systems with beating hearts. Waking before the sun, sleeping with the dead, life in a Union camp was no picnic. Drummer boys woke before dawn, often the very first to rise, beating the reveille to rouse an entire regiment. They fetched water, cleaned uniforms, delivered messages for officers. Some ran drills all day, others trained with weapons, just in case. At night they played taps, the haunting melody we now associate with military funerals. But back then, it was a lullaby in hell. Many drummer boys admitted to crying themselves to sleep after playing it, knowing they'd have to play it again the next day for someone they knew. The myth of safety and the bloody reality. The romantic idea that drummer boys were safe from danger couldn't have been more wrong. They marched with the front lines, and while some officers tried to protect them, others treated them like expendable gear. Drummers were often the first shot at, not because they posed a threat, but because silencing the drummer would throw a whole unit into confusion. And then there was Frederick Grant, son of Ulysses S. Grant. Though technically just a boy, he witnessed bloody campaigns alongside his father, and later said that what he saw aged him more than years ever could. Some boys weren't as lucky. A 12-year-old Union drummer named William Black was struck in the face by shrapnel. He lived but lost his arm. Others died on the spot, their drums splintered, their names forgotten. A drum can't stop a bullet, but it can break a heart. The drum itself was often the heaviest thing these boys carried. A full military drum could weigh up to 40 pounds, especially with brass fittings and sticks. When wet, it got heavier. On muddy roads or frozen fields, that weight turned into torture. Many boys collapsed from exhaustion. Others developed chronic injuries, twisted backs, permanent hearing loss, deformed shoulders. There were no medics for drummer boys, no pensions, no protections. And if one died in battle, his drum might be packed up, sent home with a letter, or looted by enemy soldiers as a grim trophy. Stories that echoed, some drummer boys became legends. John Clem, known as the drummer boy of Chickamauga, supposedly shot a Confederate colonel with a musket too large for his hands. He later became a general, but most didn't. Most were ordinary children caught in the machinery of war. They didn't fight for glory. They fought to survive. Letters from the time reveal their fear, their boredom, their longing for home. "Mother," one boy wrote, "the men here are kind, but the cannon is loud. I sleep with the drum so I don't forget who I am." The sound that lingers. By war's end, thousands of drummer boys had served in blue and grey. Some came home missing limbs. Some came home never speaking again. Others never came home at all. But their drums, their rhythms, still echo in history, in reenactments, in military funerals, in museum displays where dented brass and worn sticks sit behind glass. And if you close your eyes and listen closely, in the distant roll of thunder or the beat of your own heart, you might just hear the faint cadence of a boy marching into battle, a child wrapped in the sound of war, and silence. It was spring 1865. The Civil War was finally beginning to wither, its final embers flickering in the ashes of too many burned fields and blood-soaked hospital tents. But for one woman, the war was never just strategy and surrender. For Clara Barton, it was faces, names, bones buried under the wrong initials, mothers who never got to say goodbye. She had made it her mission to find them all. But among the thousands of letters she received from desperate families and missing soldiers, one stood out. A letter that arrived with no postmark, no envelope, and no explanation, just a scrap of paper and a message from someone long dead. Who was Clara Barton? Before the war, Clara Barton was a quiet school teacher and clerk, known more for her shyness than for any military ambition. But when the first wounded soldiers stumbled home from the Battle of Bull Run, something inside her changed. She became, as many would later call her, the angel of the battlefield. No official title, no uniform, just a relentless determination to follow the war to its bloodiest fronts, bringing bandages, soup, and sanity to the broken men left behind. She was shot at, nearly crushed by cannonballs. She worked by lantern light in field hospitals so unspeakably filthy that rats ran across the floors and limbs were tossed like kindling outside. But Clara stayed, again and again, the missing soldier's office. By 1865, as the war wound down, Clara opened a modest office in Washington, D.C., dubbed the Missing Soldier's Office. Her goal? To help families find their lost sons, fathers, brothers. She published names in newspapers, sent investigators to former battlefields, cross-referenced dog tags with burial trenches. At one point, over 63,000 letters flooded her small desk. She responded to them all, personally. But then came the strange one. The letter with no return address. According to surviving stories and Clara's own notes, she received a folded piece of parchment one morning. It was old, faded, as though it had been written years before and only now delivered. It read, "Tell my mother I did not run. I held the line. The chaplain said I died brave. I was not afraid. HWS, Antietam, September 17, 1862. Clara blinked. HWS. She checked her ledgers. There were dozens of H's, a few Henry W entries, but none listed as confirmed dead at Antietam, no one with those initials, no known sender, and the letter had no envelope, just the folded sheet, like someone had carried it by hand. But here's the thing, she recognized the handwriting. She had seen it before. The boy from Antietam years earlier, in 1862, Barton had worked through the night at the Battle of Antietam, still the bloodiest single-day battle in American history. Over 22,000 killed, wounded, or missing in less than 12 hours. One of the boys she treated had been struck in the leg and bled heavily, barely 16. His name was Henry Weston Sharp, HWS. He was pale, feverish, and kept asking if someone had told his mother he hadn't deserted, that he held the line, that he'd been brave. Clara comforted him as best she could. She thought he might survive. But by the time she returned the next morning, he was gone, removed from the tent. No record of where, no grave, just missing. She had never found out what became of him until the letter. How did the letter appear? To this day, no one knows. Some say a former soldier found it in a Bible and decided to forward it anonymously. Others believe it was slipped under her office door late one night. But the most enduring rumour, that no one delivered it at all, that Barton found it resting atop her desk one morning, with no one else in the office, the ink still damp, a ghost's final message. The haunting that followed. Clara never claimed to believe in ghosts, but those closest to her noted a change after that spring. She worked more quietly, sat longer by the windows. Sometimes she'd murmur, "I told her." I told his mother. And her colleagues noticed she'd begun to light a candle every September 17th, Antietam's anniversary. In her private diary, a single line appears beneath that year. "He found me, and I found her. That is enough." She never revealed who she was. History, myth, or message from beyond? Skeptics argue the letter was a fabrication, maybe even written by Barton herself, in a moment of grief or burnout, a coping mechanism. But others, especially those who worked alongside her, believed it was real. One nurse later said, "You could feel it. Something came with that paper. You didn't have to read it to know it was sacred." The original letter has since vanished. Some say it was buried with Clara. Others think it was lost in the fire that consumed much of her original office. But whether ghost story or forgotten document, the letter of HWS still circulates in Civil War lore. Clara Barton went on to found the American Red Cross. But she never stopped searching. Even in her 70s, she continued field work, helping identify the dead long after the last gunshot faded. Some say that final letter drove her, that she felt, in some invisible way, obligated to those who still had messages to send. And, perhaps, there are still letters like it. In trunks, in attics, in old family Bibles. Words never delivered, goodbyes never spoken, written in dirt, blood, or love. And maybe, just maybe, one day they'll find their way to someone like Clara again. Someone who will read them and remember. The year was 1865, and the Confederacy was unravelling like a frayed grey uniform. Richmond had fallen, Lee had surrendered, Jefferson Davis was on the run, and somewhere in the chaos, beneath canvas tarps and guarded by nervous soldiers, millions of dollars in gold and silver simply vanished. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to the Confederate treasury. All we have are clues, journal entries, conflicting testimony, and the persistent, tantalizing possibility that somewhere in the woods of Georgia, treasure still waits. The Confederate treasury, what was it? Throughout the war, the Confederate government collected hard currency, gold coins, silver bars, bank reserves, and foreign donations to fund the rebellion. But inflation, blockades, and battlefield losses made their money nearly worthless. Still, the hard currency they did manage to stockpile remained precious, guarded in banks, armories, and Jefferson Davis's own headquarters. By April 1865, the Confederacy's cash was being gathered from multiple sources into a final, desperate convoy. Jefferson Davis on the run. When Richmond fell, President Jefferson Davis fled south with his cabinet and what remained of the Confederate government. Alongside him was a caravan of wagons and trains laden with personal effects, military record, and the Confederate treasury. Reports say the amount included $500,000 in gold coins and bullion silver bars, Mexican pesos, and foreign banknotes jewellery donated by Southern women for the cause, and possibly gold from the captured Dahlonega mint. They moved under cover of night, constantly rerouting, always under threat from Union scouts, bounty hunters, and even former Confederate soldiers hoping for a cut. The plan? Escape south to Georgia, then perhaps Florida, and eventually sail to Cuba or Europe to rebuild the Confederacy from exile, but they never made it. The disappearance in Georgia. Somewhere near Washington, Georgia, around May 1865, the trail goes cold. The treasury had been split among several wagons, hidden in false bottom carts, and heavily guarded. But by the time Union forces arrived to arrest Davis, most of the money was gone, vanished. Some coins were found scattered near a ravine, a few crates discovered buried under fresh earth, but the bulk never recovered. Rumours exploded. Who took the gold? Theories abound. Some say Confederate guards, unpaid for months, simply took what they could and melted into the woods. Others blame local bandits who ambushed the caravan as it staggered through Georgia. A few even accuse Union soldiers who supposedly found the wagons and confiscated the loot unofficially, then shared it in silence. But one of the most curious suspects, the Knights of the Golden Circle, a secretive Confederate sympathizing society rumoured to have taken the gold to fund a future Southern uprising. Legend says they buried it deep in the Georgia hills, wrapped in oilcloth, waiting for a second war. There is no proof, but treasure hunters still look. The lost cause and the lost coins. In the decades after the war, the South was left in ruin, but stories of Confederate gold spread like wildfire. Old men swore they'd seen wagons dumping chests into wells. Children whispered of shadowy figures burying coins beneath sycamore trees. Farmers dug up odd Spanish silver in fields where no battle had ever been fought. The town of Danville, Virginia, even briefly believed the gold had passed through its depot and dedicated a plaque to the mystery. Newspapers capitalized on the lore. "Confederate gold found in cave," screamed headlines, though no evidence ever held up under scrutiny. A haunting tale from the Blue Ridge, one of the eeriest legends, comes from a sleepy corner of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Locals there speak of 3 Confederate soldiers who camped in a valley, guarding a heavy chest. One day, 2 rode out for supplies. They returned to find the 3rd murdered, the chest split open, the gold gone. The murder was never solved, but hikers in that same valley claim to hear the sound of metal chains dragging across stone and moaning in the fog, as though the slain guard still watches over the treasure he failed to protect. Superstition? Maybe. But the mountains don't forget. What if it was all spent? Of course, some historians argue the truth is far more mundane. By the time Davis was captured, the Confederate government had spent nearly every cent, paying off loyal troops, bribing guides, buying passage, or even distributing funds to widows and orphans. One ledger claims the treasury had been divided up and given to retreating Confederate leaders. There was no theft, it says, only desperation. But others note glaring contradictions, ledgers missing pages, soldiers who suddenly bought large farms post-war with unknown funds. Something doesn't add up. What remains today? Every few years, a new discovery sparks headlines. In 1975, a group in Georgia claimed they'd found Confederate coins buried beneath a ruined barn. Most turned out to be replicas. In the 1980s, a diver in a Florida swamp recovered a chest containing silver goblets and old banknotes, but no confirmed Confederate seal. And in 2017, a treasure-hunting documentary crew claimed sonar revealed a metal cache beneath a remote Georgian creek, but excavation was denied. The treasure, if it ever existed, remains hidden, or maybe it was never meant to be found. a symbol more than a fortune. Today, the missing Confederate gold is less about coin-y and more about closure, a symbol of how the South fell, scrambling, disjointed and full of unresolved reckonings. It's a mystery stitched into the fabric of American memory, reminding us that even in collapse, people will cling to symbols of hope, of resurrection, of fortune in the ashes. Somewhere in the woods, maybe under moss and magnolia, the treasure sleeps, or maybe it was spent on bread, bullets and bribes, leaving only stories in its place, stories that still shine like gold in the minds of those who listen. It's 1862. The war is no longer a distant thunder. It's on the doorstep, rattling windows, muddying gardens, and tearing families apart from within. In the heart of Georgia, South Carolina, or Virginia, the grand halls of southern mansions still echo with piano music and polite conversation. But the atmosphere is tight, brittle, like the china teacups balanced in trembling hands. Here, in the drawing rooms of the Confederacy's elite, the war wasn't always fought with bullets, but with glances, whispers, and the slow, simmering threat of betrayal. This is what it was really like to sip tea in a southern mansion during the American Civil War, where nothing was as calm as it seemed. The illusion of grace amid ruin. On the surface, many southern plantations clung desperately to normalcy. Silk gowns still swept over polished floors. Chandeliers still glittered. Parlour rooms hosted card games, poetry readings, and, of course, afternoon tea served in porcelain imported from France. But these rituals weren't about comfort. They were a performance, a way to deny the creeping dread just beyond the gate. Every cup poured was an act of defiance, every conversation a minefield, because while the tea cakes were sweet, the tension was sharper than any sabre. Divided houses, literally. In many elite families, not everyone supported the war, or even the same side. A woman might serve guests in grey coats and speak proudly of Southern independence, while secretly corresponding with a Unionist cousin in the North. Sons fought on opposing fronts. Fathers disowned daughters who married Northern men. Slaves whispered of freedom while folding linen napkins with shaking hands. One Virginia mansion was rumoured to host Confederate officers in the ballroom, while secretly sheltering escaped Union prisoners in the cellar. The lady of the house was never caught, but she never truly slept again. The power of polite conversation, tea in the South, was never just about refreshment. It was a weapon of diplomacy, a way to test loyalty. A visitor might casually mention a rumour. They say Sherman's forces are nearing Atlanta, and wait to see how the hostess reacts. Does she flinch, smile too broadly, change the subject? Each reaction could be damning. Saying too little marked you a sympathiser. Saying too much could earn you an arrest, or worse. Women especially walked a razor-thin line, expected to be patriotic hostesses, but also expected to spy, report, manipulate. In diaries, one Southern belle wrote, "We serve tea with grace, we lace it with lies, and we survive." The parlour as a battlefield. While men fought in trenches, the drawing room became its own battlefield of information and influence. Ladies hosted sewing circles where they stitched flags and gathered intelligence. House slaves listened carefully to visiting officers, later passing notes to Union scouts in exchange for promised freedom. In some households, invitations to tea were traps, a way for Confederate loyalists to test guests, eavesdrop, or even get someone arrested. The velvet settees, the sugar bowls, the delicate spoons, They were camouflage, and sometimes witnesses to deadly secrets, tension under silk. Women had to master their emotions. You might serve scones to a colonel who had your husband court-martialed. You might toast to the Confederacy while praying for its fall. There were moments when the mask cracked. One guest in Charleston reported watching a young hostess pour tea with shaking hands while her brother's empty boots sat in the corner, a quiet memorial no one dared mention. In New Orleans, Union occupation forced high society ladies to host officers in blue. They smiled, but later burned the linens they sat upon. Their rage wasn't loud, it was meticulous. The servants who knew everything in these mansions, the enslaved staff, witnessed it all. They fetched the silver, trimmed the candles, and served the tea, invisible but ever present. Many were literate, many could overhear strategy meetings. Some passed coded messages in laundry baskets or memorized troop movements from parlour discussions. They were not passive observers. Some historians credit the success of Union spies and scouts directly to the intelligence network formed inside these homes, people who risked beatings, death, and worse to quietly dismantle the institution that oppressed them. Even in the hush of the drawing room, revolution brewed. The longest afternoon. Not every mansion survived the war. Some were torched by Union raids. Others fell into ruin from lack of labour, supplies, or heirs. But the image of the Southern tea table, elegant, eerie, always on edge, has lingered in memory and myth. It's a scene of contradiction, a fragile calm painted over horror, a quiet stage where women held kingdoms together with sugar tongs and side glances, and beneath every lovely cup was the knowledge nothing would ever be the same again. The war after the war. Even after Appomattox, when surrender had been signed and the Confederacy lay in tatters, tea was still poured in those mansions, but now the faces had changed. Guests wore blue uniforms. The silver was tarnished. The walls bore bullet holes hidden behind portraits. And those who once used polite conversation as camouflage, many said nothing at all, because they remembered. They remembered who smiled too wide, who stood when the anthem played, who clenched their jaw when names were read aloud. Tea remained, but trust had vanished. That will be all for today's story. Thank you for joining me. I am so happy you are here.